Hello class, my name is Brianna DeMello, and today I will be elaborating on the introduction to the respiratory system. Here are our learning objectives for this unit. We will go in depth on our key points while also touching base on our vocabulary words for this section. The respiratory system has two major structures that make it up, which is the upper and the lower respiratory tract. With the upper respiratory tract, there's the nasal cavity, oral cavity, pharynx, larynx, and the paranasal sinuses. Then with the lower respiratory tract, there's the trachea, bronchi, and alveoli. The respiratory system processes oxygen and carbon dioxide by alveolar gas exchange. The gas exchange occurs across the respiratory membrane through simple diffusion. The diffusion allows for oxygen to be picked up by blood transport, then CO2 is released into the air of the alveoli. While looking at the picture, you can see through external respiration and internal respiration the gas diffusion and the gas exchange between oxygen transport and carbon dioxide transport, and between lungs and the cells and tissues. The upper respiratory tract is often referred to as the conducting zone. The conducting zone is responsible for guiding air into and out of the lungs and also prepares it for the gas exchange that occurs in the lower respiratory tract. The conducting zone filters and humidifies the air, preparing it for the lower respiratory tract. This protects us from pathogens that we have inhaled. The lower respiratory tract is known as the respiratory zone. This is where the actual gas exchange occurs of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the air and the bloodstream. While looking at our conducting passages photo, it shows the difference between the upper respiratory tract with the nasal cavity, pharynx, and larynx, and then the lower respiratory tract with the trachea, primary bronchi, and the lungs. There are different types of epithelium that are found at each respiratory organ. To go in depth, we're going to go between upper and the lower respiratory organs, and I will explain each one. So for the upper respiratory organ, the nasal cavity has pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. The oral cavity has stratified squamous epithelium, and the nasopharynx has pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. Larynx has the stratified squamous epithelium. For the lower respiratory organs, the trachea has pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, and then the bronchi and bronchioles have ciliated columnar epithelium, and the alveoli have simple squamous epithelium. While looking at the picture that I have put up on the screen, on the left side, you're going to see a diagram of the lungs, also with the trachea and larynx involved, with it all labeled out so that you can easily see what I am talking about. And on the right side, it is an actual example of what pseudostratified columnar epithelial actually looks like. The flow of air to the alveoli uses the conducting zone. The flow of air to the alveoli starts at the nasal cavity, which helps humidify the air, then goes to the pharynx, then air passes through the larynx, which is also known as the voice box, then air travels to the trachea, that then conducts air further into the chest. The trachea then divides into bronchi, that then leads into lungs, which then turn into bronchioles, which then become the alveolar ducts. The alveolar ducts eventually open up into little clusters that are surrounded by blood vessels and capillaries. This then turns into the gas exchange. There are two types of alveolar cells, and that would be type 1 and type 2. Type 1 alveolar cells make up 97% of the alveolar wall, and they are squamous epithelial cells. Type 2 alveolar cells are randomly within the alveolar and are used to prevent alveoli from sticking to each other. This diagram of the lungs shows the bronchus splitting into bronchioles and then turns into alveoli, which looks like small clusters. The diagram also shows how the clusters are surrounded by blood vessels and the capillaries as well. Now we are going to talk about the lungs and go in depth about them. So the overall function of the lung is to facilitate the interchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide within the atmosphere. This also requires blood from the pulmonary circuit. The blood flow pattern associated with the lungs is the pulmonary circuit. The anatomy of blood supply to the lungs start with the pulmonary arteries that then carries blood to the lung, and that also takes oxygen. The oxygenated blood goes back to the heart and through the pulmonary vein, then into the left atrium. The blood then moves to the bicuspid valve and into the left ventricle, where blood is then propelled into the aortic valve, then into the aorta. This is also known as the pulmonary circuit. This next diagram shows the pulmonary circuit that shows both right and left lungs. This diagram also has everything labeled to explain the blood flow and anatomy of blood supply to the lungs. The pleura of the lungs consists of two layers, the visceral and parietal. Visceral pleura is the inner layer of the lung, while parietal is the outer layer of the lung. Pleurae perform two major functions. That is, producing pleural fluid and creating separation between lungs and other organs. This prevents other organs from moving and also prevents infection. This diagram actually shows the whole lung, but if you look closely, it'll show you the visceral pleura, the parietal pleura, and the pleural cavity, which is where the pleural fluid is actually in, and so that's really interesting to look at. The mechanisms that drive breathing are pulmonary ventilation. The primary mechanisms controlling pulmonary ventilation encompass atmospheric pressure, which is the pressure in the alveoli, referred to the intrapulmonary pressure, and then the pressure inside the pleural cavity as well. This is also known as intrapleural pressure. Breathing is guided by the principles of pressure and volume. When pressure rises, volume decreases, and vice versa. Boyle's law plays a significant role in comprehending the connection between pressure and lung volume while breathing. In inhalation, lung volume expands, leading to a reduction in pressure. Pressure and volume are interconnected through the concept of pulmonary ventilation. This consists of two primary phases, inspiration and expiration. Inspiration is the action that permits the admission of air into the lungs, while expiration is the process that facilitates the outlet of air from the lungs. This diagram shows how with breathing in, the chest expands and the diaphragm actually contracts. Then, with breathing out, chest contracts and the diaphragm actually relaxes. The next thing that we're going to elaborate on is mechanical coupling. Mechanical coupling is the synchronized action of the lungs in conjunction with the expansion or contraction of the thoracic cavity. Respiratory rate is the rate at which breathing occurs. This is set and controlled by the respiratory center of the brain. The respiratory rate is measured by breaths per minute. This diagram shows inhalation and exhalation, which is considered one breath. The mechanisms behind the control of breathing is regulated by the respiratory center, which is located in the medulla oblongata. There are two respiratory centers for the medulla oblongata. This consists of the dorsal respiratory group, also known as DRG, and the ventral respiratory group, also known as VRG. DRG is for the inspiratory motor neurons, and VRG is for the expiratory motor neurons. DRG maintains constant breathing, while VRG controls forced breathing. If you look at the diagram above, it actually shows where the medulla oblongata is, and if you look closely enough, you'll see the dorsal respiratory group, which is for inspiratory, and then the ventral respiratory group, which is for expiratory. Continuing on the topic of respiratory centers, we are now going to talk about the respiratory center that is located in the pons. The respiratory of the pons is the second respiratory center. This is called pontine respiratory group. This consists of two subcenters for DRG. This controls the depth of inspiration, but also suppresses the function of inspiration neurons within the DRG. This also promotes relaxation following the inhalation phase and consequently controlling the overall respiratory rate. This diagram shows where the pons is in relation to the medulla oblongata, which is where all of the respiratory centers are. Lastly, we are going to talk about sensory input. Sensory input to the respiratory centers influence respiratory rate by two types of chemoreceptors. These are also known as the central and peripheral chemoreceptors. Central chemoreceptors are specialized receptors that are located in the brain and the brainstem. Peripheral chemoreceptors are specialized receptors that are located in the carotid arteries and aortic arch. Thank you for listening to my presentation. This next slide is just my reference page. If you need any more clarification, feel free to just look at my references. Thank you.